Welcome to today's session, in which you'll have an opportunity to ask me almost anything about how to tease our client needs, when we're looking to do analytics projects or initiatives. My name is Michiko Walcott. I will be the host, the presenter, and the moderator for the session. Now, for those of you who do not know me, a little bit of introduction. I've been in a data and analytics consulting and delivery business for over 20 years, and having run a large multinational analytics consulting practice. Now, I currently work as a kind of a strategic and management consultant, advising clients on the non-technical aspects of data and analytics. So my focus is especially on closing this gap, right, between the technical and the business side, as well as among the various stakeholders involved. And basically, so I cover everything outside of actually doing analytics that make, data and analytics more successful and run more smoothly. By the way, I use the term analytics rather broadly for convenience to include statistics, data science, and other related fields and branches. So none of this is like super specific to a particular type of applied data analysis, if you will. So before we start, we have some housekeeping items. First, this session, if you have noticed, the session is being recorded, and by staying in the meeting, you will consent to be part of the recording. Now, otherwise, please feel free to leave and wait for the recording. Everybody who registered will receive a link to the recording, as well as a copy of the slide deck. Also, since I will be running a one-person show, I apologize in advance for any glitches and mishaps and whatever else that could happen. In consideration for the other attendees, as well as to make this session a little bit more manageable for me, your cooperation in keeping your video and mic off is very, very much appreciated. So the objective of the session is to address how to kind of translate the client's business or research needs into the right problem to be addressed with analytics, right? In the audience, we have analytics practitioners who work on specific analytics problems defined by the client, right? And at the end, the other extreme, we have some practitioners whose job includes essentially having to convince clients of the need for analytics and what kind. And we have everything in between. We also have some attendees in the audience who are not analytics practitioners, but are here as a, let's say, client of analytics services or as a consultant in something other than analytics. Since this is a common topic that covers a very wide variety of scenarios, I'll be as broad as possible, which then means that there may be some scenarios that may not directly, apply to your specific situation, but the fundamentals will still stand. And I'll speak primarily from the point of view of the analytics practitioner, but that's more for convenience, and I won't get into any technical details. So we'll start by identifying some common scenarios. Then we'll take a step back, right? And then look at whether the problem is even something that analytics can solve. A lot of us go like, well, that's not really an analytics problem. But often we don't know how to get the client to kind of understand why it's not an analytics problem. I'll talk about some fundamental gaps in how we approach the problem definition, then get into the specific steps on how you can sort of tease out what the real analytics needs are. And I will address some of the questions that were submitted in the registration as I go along. Then we'll get to open Q&A. And for this, please use the chat panel to submit your questions throughout. You don't have to wait until we actually get to the Q&A section. I'll try to answer as many as I can in the time we have. Unmuting has been disabled to help me manage the session. By the way, if you registered and submitted a question in the last 30 minutes, please resubmit here during the session because I would not have seen it. And I'll keep my responses to questions that are directly related to the topic so as to not distract too much and to get off rail. We do have participants from all over the world. You're welcome to submit your question in English, Spanish, Portuguese, or even Japanese, I suppose. The answer will be in English. It's not at all common for non-analytics people to think that they have an analytics problem at hand, when in reality, they really don't, right? A lot of this is kind of brought on by the push for the digital and accelerated by the pandemic because now everything's online, right? In many cases, the clients tell you specifically what they want solved with analytics, but the problem you end up solving is often different from the problem that was presented to you. Or the clients tell you they want to apply, the regression, they want regression applied, or they want clustering, or what have you, right? And these specifications don't really make sense for, what you eventually find out to be the real problem. And perhaps, unfortunately, after you've actually completed the analysis, or you solve for the problem originally presented and the client says, well, this isn't what I wanted, right? Rarely ever does the client come with the exact problem and it actually be the problem you should be solving for, right? Then too often when we think we both kind of understand each other and that are, when we think we're aligned, then it turns out that like we're both wrong. So where, how does this happen? So I'm going to take a giant step back and look at some fundamental concepts that are often confused with each other, especially in today's world and becoming really from a digital perspective. So the word digitization, right, has become one of the hottest topics, in large part because the pandemic has forced everything to go online. Now, a lot of people think it's about data. Well, sort of it is, but it's not, right? But digital is really just a format. If if something is not digital, it's analog or physical, right? So this digital is something that's not analog or physical. So then digitization is really, when you think about it, simply converting something analog or physical into a digital format. Kind of think about that for a bit. Now, before digitization, automation was like the thing, right? So much so that some people thought that automation was actually analytics. Again, it's helpful to think of the opposite. If it's not automated, then it's manual, right? You can automate something digital or you can automate something physical. It's not, they're in kind of a different dimension, if you would, with data. So at the fundamental level, data is synonymous with information. It does not have to be digital. Analog data is a thing, and physical data like printed data still exists, right? At the end of the day, analytics is just a bunch of methods for processing information just to make it more digestible and easier to consume, right? In fact, its output is also information. Now, some people call the result of the process of analysis, like models and so forth, an analytic. But information is really something for us to know and understand. It doesn't really do anything in the sense of performing a task. Information is not tools in the sense that we normally think of as tools. So we can't touch it, we can't feel it or click it, right? It's the least tangible of these three concepts, and therefore the hardest to talk about. To put it another way, information is a thing to be conveyed, whereas digitization and automation are things to be accomplished, right? So in my experience, people who misunderstand what analytics is think that analytics kind of result in some tool or something a lot more tangible rather than something to be conveyed. I think this is one of the gaps. Now, you could obviously know things just for the sake of knowing, right? As an intellectual exercise. In practice, though, the need for information really stems from the need to make a decision. This is not a trivial point. And it helps clarify whether the need is information or something else. Now, we can, for example, use automation to collect, process, and present information. But in that case, your need is still information, and automation is simply how you get it, right? Then information can be embedded in digitization or automation to make those other things a little bit smarter. But in that case, the primary objective is still to digitize or automate. Now, if your client is relatively new to analytics, we need to be aware that he or she may not be entirely clear on these distinctions. Now, out of these, the only need that the analytics practitioner solves by definition, let's say, is the need for information, making it easier to consume and so forth. But again, it's the need to know. Now, that said, the use cases often overlap among them, right? So for example, even when the primary need is automation, it doesn't really mean that there's no analytics involved. A lot of, just as an example, a lot of what's commonly called AI today is essentially a series of automated decisions, right? And more classically, automated decisions have been quite common in mass decisioning because, well, it's impossible for humans to make millions of decisions one by one. But each one of those millions of decisions can be informed by analytics, right? Automated decisions, but each one of those informed by analytics. Now, after all, it is just as easy to automate an intelligent decision 1,000,000 times as it is to automate dumb decisions 1,000,000 times. So in any case, it's important to recognize that there are really two components to this. One is making good decisions to be informed by information, and the other is automating the decision process. Two different components. Okay, so let's say that we know the need is for information, specifically to inform a decision in an easily consumable way. So there we go, enter analytics, right? Now what do you do? How do you move forward? This is what I call the first rule of data. You do not talk about data. And the second rule of data, you do not talk about data. Now, the Fight Club reference aside, what happens when we think about data, right? On one hand, we get fixated on it, right? The bigger problem is the following. First, by talking about data, you're starting with the how and backing into the what. We all know that's a big no-no, but get data involved and somehow we are perfectly comfortable ignoring that golden rule. Second, all existing data are biased. Right? A key exception is like when you have design primary research, but that's a relatively small portion of analytics in today's world. Now, this means that taking some data, then mapping it back to the problem inherently leads you to less than optimal insights, or actually in many cases leads you to the wrong insights. Now, unfortunately, it's much easier to talk about data than to try to articulate the problem to be solved. The data-driven mandate, in air quotes, right, has sort of conditioned us to take the data we have and do something with it. This is one of the many reasons I kind of cringe at the expression data-driven. One of many. The world today kind of promotes statistical mechanics rather than statistical thinking. But we do statistical thinking every day. It's really just critical thinking with empirical evidence. It's not any more complicated than that. So, in everyday life, I go to the fridge to find out what I have so that I can decide what to make for dinner, right? Or if you're more, if you like sports, the quarterback in a football game prepares to pass and goes through his progressions to take in information to decide, who do I pass the ball to or whether to take off running. Right. Now, we don't start with information. Rather, we need to decide what to make for dinner, it's like what to make for dinner. Therefore, I go to the fridge, right? Or the quarterback needs to decide what to do. Therefore, he takes in his read. You need to make a specific decision. Therefore, you get information. It just does not work the other way around. And the third rule of data is that you need to articulate the business or research decision to be informed. Sometimes this is kind of talked about in terms of, well, how you use analytics, right? But that's way too vague. You can just say like, well, I'm going to make a decision with it. And you're like, well, okay, so what? Help the client recognize the need to make a decision, not just generically to solve a business or research problem. This is important because automation solves a business problem. Digitization also solves a business problem, but neither informs a decision. That's the key point. Now, these decisions, right, can be intermediate in the sense that, for example, in an exploratory analysis phase, you decide what your next set of questions should be, and then another round of analysis helps you kind of decide on the next set of questions, and you can iterate on that. all these are decisions, right? And in any case, you are doing analysis, you're kind of doing things in order to feed those decisions. So using a typical framework for an analytics development life cycle, and there are several variations of this, but this one works. You're supposed to start with understanding the problem in step 1, then design the solution in step 2 based on that understanding, then develop the solution by analyzing the data in step 3 based on that design, then deploy the solution in step 4. Then the end users use the solution, we review and monitor the results, and we start all over again, right? But unfortunately, we've done this rather poorly, right? And historically speaking. In many cases that use existing data, we would sort of like let the data speak, again, the air quotes, by analyzing the data and developing the solution, then deploying it. Then when it gets to the users, they're like, well, what do I do with this? Or why do I need this? Or, well, I can't use this, right? You have the classic case of the hammer looking for a nail to hit. Of course, the current best practice is to start by understanding the problem in step 1. So it may be true that we're doing it better now, but only to an extent, I would argue. Because even that's not really sufficient for a couple of reasons. First, we don't articulate the problem enough. Often it's way too vague. And second, the business or research problem, as stated, often does not correspond to how the analytic is to be consumed by the end user. So we end up solving for what we believe is the problem, not solving for what the problem actually is. Or you end up solving the symptom of the problem, not the root cause. So in reality, this has even created this kind of false sense that starting with a problem is adequate when we haven't gone far enough to understand the where and how the analytic will be consumed, and the gap continues to exist. So we need to get to the decision, not just a problem, because the purpose of analytics is to inform a decision, not just to generically solve a business problem. So this means that to correctly articulate the need, you have to start thinking about step 5. That is, by articulating exactly what decision the end user will be making with the analytic. Now, if the intended users, end users do not use the analytic to make decisions, what the analytics practitioner does is simply an intellectual exercise. There's no impact, right? Like anything else in the consumer world, without consumption, there is no real reason to produce and there's no market. So we have to kind of close this gap. The key is to recognize and articulate the need for information for the specific decision to be made, right? This requires, really understanding the need around the decision as well. And here's the thing, right? Don't take the problem presented at face value. Don't just kind of blindly accept it, right? We need to kind of tease out the true objective decision that is usually hidden somewhere else. It's not always there. It's rare that it's like right there in the first go. So as analytics practitioners, we kind of want to go straight to, well, what data do you have? Again, the kind of first rule of data, right? Do not talk about data. So instead, identify and articulate the specific pain point in non-analytics, non-data terms. You can start broad, but you need to eventually narrow it down as much as possible. Obviously, more specific, the better. Even if the client already comes with a specific problem to be solved, take a step back and connect to a particular pain point or pain point in broadly speaking, right? Don't make the mistake of trying to sell the idea of analytics to people here. That rarely works, and that's an entirely different topic anyways. Second, analyze the problem. Not just do the analysis, but before even you do the analysis, analyze the problem. Now, this is how you can do with the clients. You can do this by asking lots of open-ended questions or some open-ended questions. And there are two parts to this. One is to understand the context. right? So you want to kind of know the context in which the problem or the question or whatever resides, the decision that resides. The other is to really get to the root of the problem that requires decisioning, right? There are simple things you can do, like applying the famous 5 whys that are often used in process improvement. Why is that? Why is that, right? And then you kind of, the idea is that it usually takes about 5 iterations of why is that to get to the root problem or the real problem or real question to be resolved, right? It's very simple. It's very effective. Even if your client comes to you with a very specific or business or research problem, or even if your client comes to you with a very specific idea of the type of analysis, spend some time asking questions and getting them to answer, obviously, to understand what's behind and around the presented need. And especially when the presented problem is impossible to answer with analytics, there's always something behind it, right? You want to understand what you're really solving for. Have a conversation. Question about, the context, right? More context you have and more you understand, the better your analysis is going to be. What's the background? What are the factors involved? Are there any even legal, business, or ethical implications? Now, this is not a place for you to, impart your knowledge, or this is not a place for us. I'm talking, from the perspective of analytics practitioners. This is not a place for us to impart our knowledge. It's rather for our clients to impart their knowledge to us. Also, I emphasize open questions. So, in a generic way, it could be like, well, can you tell me more about, this or that or the other thing? Play dumb if you need to, right? My general rule of thumb is that at this stage, the client should fill at least 80% of the airtime and the analytics person at most 20%, and do so with the fewest number of questions possible, right? If you ask a lot of closed-ended questions, that can kind of annoy your clients, like, oh, what is this? Okay, this, what it is, that, that gets a little annoying after a while. Also, but more importantly, open-ended questions can often kind of bring up some points that will be missed by closed-end questions. And at this stage, closed-end questions can be quite limiting, in fact. And with all this, right, the idea is to really lead the client to discover the right problem to be solved on his or her own, not try to tell them or convince them what is and isn't the right way to solve, or what isn't the right question based on your expertise. This is a little tricky, right? You want them to kind of make it their own. You want the client to define their own problem or define their own solution, as opposed to us telling them, hey, this is how this is what you've got, this is how you should do it, because that just creates a whole nother set of disconnects. The bottom line of all this, right? Analytics people by nature like to solve problems. We like to solve problems. By nature, we tend to jump right into solutioning. How can I solve? Okay, I heard it. How can I solve it, right? Hold yourself back. We do not spend nearly enough time analyzing the problem itself. There's so much behind the ask than we ever realize. Often there's something that drives a problem, maybe that's not even at all related to analytics, but has an impact on your ability to fulfill the need. We want to understand all that to have the best chance at success. So, well, now once you get past all that, right, determine if the need is digitization, automation, or information, or something else for that matter. Help the client isolate these concepts, because it may not be a problem to be solved by analytics. If there's a digitization component, what needs to be digitized? If there's an automation component, what needs to be automated? And if there is an information component, then we need to articulate the decision to be informed by the analytic. So this includes things like, what is the unit of decision? This corresponds to essentially the sampling unit in statistical terms. An example, right? You're a bank and you need to decide whether to approve or reject an application for credit. is the unit of decision. What are you evaluating? Are you evaluating a person, or are you evaluating an application, right? There's a theoretical answer and a practical answer to this, which are not always the same. But you do need to know the difference and what, if anything, you're giving up for practicality, because that has implications on the analysis design and the use of the resulting analytic. Who, in terms of role or function, will make the decision? What are his or her choices in that decision? Now, if there is no information component, then it's not something to be solved by analytics, right? Pass that on to someone who can address it. Or, if there's an information component and also other components, figure out who you need to team up with. Like, it could be IT developers, if you need like digitization or automate something, so forth. So now, here is the hard part, right? Do all this without referring to words like data analytics, statistics, machine learning, models, score, et cetera, and all of their relatives. They definitely do not talk about AI. Right? We've been conditioned to think that we're behind if we're not thinking data from the get-go. And so when clients come to us and say, I don't know how data can help me, invariably, the first thing we ask is, well, what data do you have? Right? Or even when the client comes to us with what appears to be a very specific question, we ask, well, okay, what data do you have? Before we attempt to discern if that's even the right question in the first place. Now, of course, there are cases for which this paradigm doesn't quite fit, but that's a relatively small portion of the analytics realm today anyways. There are two problems with jumping into data discussion right away. Well, first, you will fixate on data and distract everybody from discussing the actual need. Once you ask about the data, there really is no turning back. It's lost. The second problem with jumping into data right away is that you have all but ensured your analytic will be biased. Right? I don't mean like racial and gender bias, but rather the statistical bias, if you would. You start with the data and you fit the solution to the bias in the data by design. Sure, some of that needs to be done for practical purposes, and it is done quite often. But using the data as a starting point will essentially guarantee that you'll be off target by design. And you don't want to do that by design. Now, many people, including data practitioners, kind of incorrectly think that data is the objective truth, right? It rarely is. It is a truth, but not the truth relative to the specific problem. The bias we're talking about is really the difference between the two. That is the deviation from the objective truth, right? And this is a concept that is generally not very well understood. So we have to be cognizant of that fact. Now, for those of you who are on the side of the business or research rather than analytics, none of this requires any technical knowledge. So you can help us close this gap. If you can get this far, you'll have a much better chance of getting what you need from analytics. Now, then you can do more discovery and start getting into the how, right? Or you need to articulate the exact definitions involved. For example, it's like, what do you mean by active members or active clients? That's always a kind of an interesting one. It's like active. It's sort of, you see it, when you see active, but what does it really mean, right? And then you can finally talk about data, but not until here. So just to give you a little bit of frame of reference, right? In a typical 2-hour discovery session, like if I ran one or that I have run, I think I might talk about data maybe 15 to 20 minutes total, right? That's out of 120 minutes, right? And not in the first 90 minutes. Yes, it's true. There is a risk in defining all this and there not being any relevant data, but then the discussion will shift to where there might be relevant data and how you might get it, but not from the start. You do not start from that. If you really want to solve the client problem, The point is, in the vast majority of the cases, we start talking about data and techniques way too early in the process, right? And sort of like kind of pigeonholes us into a particular solution or conflict even. And a lot of conflict stems from that. Again, none of these are technical or even require that much data knowledge. The analytics practitioner does not always need to have domain expertise either. I know I'm going to get a lot of question or a lot of dissent from this, but you don't always need to have 100, all kinds of domain expertise to get to this point. Now, to solve it is a different story, but you just, at this point, you just need to know how to ask good questions, be really listening, and use a little bit of common sense. The biggest gap is not in the production, but in the consumption of analytics, okay? Almost all of that is determined by how we approach at the beginning. That's what we need to facilitate and ensure to the best of our ability. So before we go on Q&A, a little bit of I guess shout out to myself in a sense. You can check out what else I have to say on my website and sign up for future email updates and so forth. I try to do one of these sessions every so many months or so. You can follow me on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook, etc. With that, I am happy to take questions. I know there have been some questions that's come up. Okay. Interested in thoughts on a very generic question. Do you find it helpful to direct discussion with clients by identifying the kind of problem the client is hoping to understand, like find new customer opportunities, plan, deploy personnel based on backlog, et cetera, to the point the problem often isn't defined, but at least in my experience, the basic kind of question hasn't really been illuminated. That is a fabulous question. I think there's some, it sort of depends on how much awareness there is within the organization, right? Or within the leadership, within whoever it is that you're talking to. There's absolutely merit and there's absolute merit in sort of trying to create awareness, if you would. But at some point we'll have to kind of, once they become a little bit aware, it's like, that's why kind of talking about use cases and case studies from other organizations kind of work, right? Oh, they've done this, they've done it. Okay, so creating awareness works. At some point, we're going to have to sort of figure out what's most, what's important to them as an organization. What's so what are their strategies? What are you going to try to get you to even get up to okay, here are your strategic sort of objectives, right? Okay, how it all kind of connects up to that. I'm sort of a big fan of connecting everything into the big sort of ideas or big needs that that ultimately sits at the top. And so at some point, yes, okay, if you're talking to a customer service or customer management department and say, okay, we can say something like, well, we can help you better manage your customer better. Well, that's kind of vague. But then you can kind of get into okay, what are your biggest needs, or what are your biggest pain points, or what do you need to accomplish the most right now or in the next 5 years? Or you can prime the question a little bit, but make sure that you're connecting to their, at the end of the day, you're connecting to their sort of ultimate need and what their responsibilities are. So hopefully I addressed that. Next question. If a client recommends an analytic approach that will not work, how do you convince them to use a different approach? And this is kind of an interesting one because there's the empowerment. There's a fine line between empowerment through knowledge and sort of misunderstanding, right? Again, I would recommend anytime you have a conflict or anytime you have differences of opinion and so forth, I would recommend taking a step back. rather than it's funny because I think our sort of instinct is to dig in deeper, right? Sort of like, oh, let's break this down. It's like, no, take a step back and then sort of figure out where that might be coming from. People tend to like bigger pictures, bigger sort of grand scheme of things. But take a step back and try to figure out try to place, if you would, where that question's coming from, or try to why do you think why do you think that's a good approach, and then ask lots of why questions, right? I like whys, because then that will sort of kind of get you to where that stuff is coming from, and not get too much into the actual technical explanations until they're ready to sort of receive that technical explanation. I think we tend to jump right into, okay, that's not it. No, this is not correct. This is the way you should do it, and you just kind of get this pushback, right? It's like, well, no, I think I'm right. Nobody really wins anything by saying I think I'm right. So, okay, do you have any recommended resources to improve an organization's data literacy? I could go like into the whole, a lot of time, let's say, spend a lot of time in talking about data literacy. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding about what data literacy is in many cases, meaning that it's not, where a lot of kind of gap or a lot of barrier has been not so much about the technical aspect of data, right? And I think that's what a lot of data literacy programs are today, but really, how do you sort of prepare them to be good consumers, good users of data? And so it's kind of tough a lot of times to find good resources for that, because again, today's kind of data literacy problems are centered around the technical understanding of data, which, yes, it absolutely helps, right? I'm not saying that it's useless. It absolutely helps. But there's a big part of kind of the big part missing of, okay, then how do you kind of connect to my needs, and how do I make that so that I can consume and I can do better? That tends to be a lot more about kind of, again, it's kind of making sure they're involved, or they're involved in the definition process and the process of identifying what you're solving for. Hence the insistence on kind of starting, with step 5 of that wheel in mind. I think the technical stuff is a lot easier to solve for, right? It's but then it's sort of like we kind of forget that we're all humans somewhere along the line, and we're working with humans, and you can sort of impart knowledge to an extent, but then that has to be accepted, and all these other things. And so it's at least in my experience, it's been more about, not so much about data literacy as it's currently understood today, typically understood today, but it's been more about how do you change the organizational process of consuming data and analytics. And a lot of that has to do with sort of nudging the culture a little bit, how do you sort of get people involved? How do you get people engaged with respect to data and analytics? And so that's a slightly different problem from, well, that's a very different problem from, what most people think of when we talk about data literacy. So no, it's a short answer to all that, but the short answer to your question is no, I don't. That said, and there are plenty of technical resources out there that are pretty good. It goes through all kinds of things, and but the heart of all that, the disconnect tends to be really not so much about the technical understanding, but the willingness to get engaged, to be engaged, willingness to kind of use, willingness to even change, right? So there's a lot of change management involved. Yes, the statistics side of things, ASA statement on p-values does have some really good discussion about what is good research. I think in some ways, research and somewhat different from the business side of things. Business can also be very technical as well, but in sort of like thinking about what's happened in the last couple of years or so, and everybody's talking digital, just like how many times have you heard digital transformation, right? And so now everybody's thinking digital data, all those things. To an extent, that has been a very different problem from what has happened on the research side, and hence the whole thing with the p-values and so forth. Yeah, the research side, I think, it tends to have slightly different problem in that along that dimension. But yes, absolutely, I do recall and actually have a copy of that statement on p-value somewhere. So absolutely. Other questions? I believe I've addressed most, if not all, of the questions related to the topic that were submitted in the registration. So nothing else? In that case, well, excellent. Thank you very much for your attention and coming here and asking questions. And I hope that this was somewhat useful. And just again, thanks for coming, and y'all have a great day.